Okay, let me make sure I get all the. All right, we'll get started, everyone. For the record, my name is Andrea Campbell, and I am currently the counselor for District 4, which is largely Dorchester, Mattapan, a little bit of Jamaica Plain and Rosendale. I am also the chair of the Committee on Public Safety and Criminal Justice. I'm going to adjust my screen, and hopefully this won't be blind, so you guys can all see me. I'm the chair of the committee on the Boston City Council's Committee on Public Safety and Criminal Justice. I'm joined by my council colleagues in order of their arrival: Councilor Asabi George, Councilor Flynn, Councilor Bach, Councilor Mejia. I'm sorry, Councilor Asabi George, Councilor Flynn, Councilor Bach, Councilor Baker, Councilor Mejia, and Councilor Arroyo, who is my co-sponsor on this. And if I have other colleagues join, I will acknowledge them as they arrive. This hearing is a public hearing that's being recorded. It's being live streamed at boston.gov/citycounciltv and broadcast on Xfinity Channel 8, RCN Channel 82, and FiOS Channel 1964 or 964. We will take public testimony at the end of this hearing. So if folks wish to testify, one via video conference, they can email shane.pac@boston.gov to sign up. If other folks want to submit written testimony, they can do that at ccc.ps@boston.gov. For public testimony, I ask that you state your name and affiliation and limit your comments to 2 minutes. Today's hearing is on docket number 0143, order for a hearing regarding the Boston Police Department's gang database. We will have 2 panels. The first will be of community-based organizational leaders. The second will be administration in the police department. And when we get to that stage, I will, of course, announce all panelists and make sure that every council colleague has a copy of who those folks are. I want to thank Councilor Arroyo for your continued partnership on this particular issue, as well as some other issues. For years, residents and advocates have been raising serious concerns about the Boston Police Department's gang database, which is maintained by the BRIC, and the harm it has caused in largely Black, Brown, and immigrant communities in the city of Boston. Today, we'll focus on 3 main areas. Transparency. Most Bostonians don't know anything about this database. They don't know that it exists, even though there are over 5,000 people who are listed. We definitely need greater transparency around how a person is added or removed, the ability to request personal information from the BRIC in terms of whether or not you may be on the gang database, and the information that is shared with other law enforcement agencies out of the gang database. The second topic is around accountability. It is critically important that the city have systems in place to actually ensure justice and accountability if and when someone is wrongfully targeted, stopped, arrested, or in some cases deported as a result of being wrongfully listed on the database. The last area of discussion will be the racial disparities. There are profound racial disparities in policing in the city of Boston. We not only know it from the FIO data that was recently released last year, but we also know it from the information related to the gang database. And sadly, the disparities in our FIO data are not as exacerbated as those in our gang database. Although Boston's population is roughly 25% Black and 20% Latino and Latinx, over 90% of the individuals listed in the police department's gang database are Black or Latino or Latinx. Folks with no criminal record can be added to this database because of a perceived association with an assumed or known gang member. And we cannot ignore how racial profiling by our police department affects this, including with respect to our FIO data. We'll hear more, of course, from the advocates and folks who have been working on these issues for years, and how inclusion in the gang database can have serious and harmful consequences, not just to the individual, but to a community and to a family, including denial of employment, licenses, a negative impact on bond or parole, a negative impact on bail, parental rights, immigration, and violation of First Amendment rights. There was actually a recent case in the First Circuit Court of Appeals in which a young man was deported because his name was in a gang database just based on FIO data for acting like a teenager and hanging out with his young Latino Latinx friends. One judge dissented in that, and he said, Diaz was denied relief from removal based on quintessential teenage behavior, hanging out with friends who unsurprisingly were all young Hispanic men. The record lacks any evidence that those social encounters were linked to criminal activity that would have been a proper basis for recording them, and any explanation by the government as to why the point system is nevertheless a reliable means of determining gang membership, end quote. This was a recent case that really spoke to some of the troubling concerns with respect to the gang database. There was also, of course, recent information that we all learned about an undocumented student at East Boston High School who was deported after a Boston school police incident report alleged that he was a gang associate, even though he had no criminal history. He was on track to get his green card. He was held in immigration detention for over a year before he was deported to El Salvador. We've had a couple of letters that the committee has received from community organizations emphasizing how this database can be useful in their violence prevention efforts. And I want to thank everyone who's already submitted letters of support of this database or other written testimony. But one thing I do want to stress is that every letter that spoke about the value of the gang database in their prevention efforts, all of them agreed that racial disparities do exist and must be addressed, including through greater accountability and transparency with the database. We must, of course, make sure that there are tools and strategies in place, that we have a system to not only, of course, solve crime and incidents of violence, but to make sure that we are actually effectively breaking cycles of violence, trauma, incarceration, and not perpetuating them. And if we want to be successful, we are going to have to reevaluate our tools and develop new ones. I absolutely look forward to this hearing and this conversation with all of you. I will say, I want to thank the advocates, of course, for being a part of this conversation. I will adjust my blinds in a minute so you can probably see me better. But I also want to thank everyone for being at the table. This is not an easy conversation to have, but it is a necessary one. So thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Councilor Arroyo for remarks. Thank you, Councilor Arroyo, for the partnership.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for your leadership on this as well. This is obviously a longstanding issue, the gang database. Before I came to this work, I was actually a public defender where I worked for the Committee for Public Counsel Services. So I'm very aware of the issues with the gang database in terms of how it's compromised, in terms of how they put folks on it, but also just the issues that we have with what gets you on this list. And frankly, what we have here is a gang database of over, at least at last count, 5,000 people, over 90% people of color, that is comprised with no checks or balance in how you get into the system. It's based on observations, FIOs, field interrogations observations, which are also known as stop and frisk. And FIOs, for the record, in Commonwealth v. Warren, it was made very clear based on data as to how Blacks and Latinos are stopped disproportionately. And I'm going to quote directly from Commonwealth Warren, that rather the finding that Black males in Boston are disproportionately and repeatedly targeted for FIO, and just so folks know, Commonwealth v. Warren was a Supreme Judicial Court case in Massachusetts, encounters suggest a reason for flight totally unrelated to consciousness of guilt. Such an individual, when approached by the police, might just as easily be motivated by the desire to avoid the recurring indignity of being racially profiled as by the desire to hide criminal activity. Given this reality for Black males in the city of Boston, a judge should, in appropriate cases, consider the report's findings and weighing flight as a factor in the reasonable suspicion calculus. And so what we have is FIOs are so racially disparate. They're so on their face racist that we have the SJC making a determination that if a Black man, or I'm assuming, frankly, as an attorney, I would argue a Latino male too by these numbers, ran from an officer, that shouldn't be calculated in a reasonable suspicion calculus because there's other reasons they could do so, such as the indignity of being stopped unnecessarily. And what we have with the gang database here is 5,000 names. I don't know what it is now. I'm hoping we get an update on what the number is. I know there was some work to pare that down. But what we know about gang databases nationally is that in Portland, they've removed it. In Chicago, there's been known instances of folks on that gang database that don't belong on that gang database. In LA, in San Francisco, in New York. And so what we're talking about is in every case nationally that they've looked at gang databases, there's people on them that don't belong on them. And so either we're going to say that in Boston, we're the exception and that somehow we have a gang database that is accurate to the T, or we're going to say that the gang database as it's currently comprised has folks on it that don't belong on it, that are at risk for things as serious as deportation from this country. And we're going to see this as the problem that it should be seen as, which is, frankly, infringement, not just on our rights individually as residents of this city to exist on streets or to associate with who we wish to associate with, and not have that be guilt by association because I sit at the same lunch table, or I take the same bus, or I play at the basketball park, at the park in the basketball court with my friends. And so now I'm a gang member or a gang associate. And so I think we have to really analyze whether or not whatever, positives we're attributing to the gang database, whatever those may be, which it sounds like it's helpful for classification of individuals, I guess. If we're looking at that as a positive, what are the negatives? And the negatives are we're creating a database where people are at risk if they have ever find themselves in criminal court, which disproportionately and systemically in this country, if you're a person of color, you're more likely to do that and to find yourself there due to no wrongdoing of your own or any reason other than the way that this system is set up to operate. Or alternatively, if you're somebody here who is not documented and is going through a process to become documented or to stay in this country, you can find yourself deported on the basis of these reports. And so I think that seriousness really, really, to me, negates the positives, whatever they may be, to this gang database. And I look forward to asking some very pointed questions about how this operates and how we get folks off of it and how we get folks on it. And I would just say that, for me personally, I'm for the abolition of it. I don't see its purpose. I don't see how it's helpful. I hear from other folks that it's okay to look at it in the context, even with the racial profiling and the systemic issues that it creates. And so I would say that just doesn't ring true to me, and I don't agree with it. And so moving forward, I look forward to having a conversation today with both folks that are impacted by it and folks who serve communities that are impacted by it, as well as BRIC and BPD. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councilor Arroyo. And for the sake of time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go straight to the panel, but I do want to acknowledge we've been joined by not just Councilor Mejia, Councilor Flaherty, and Councilor Wu. I'm going to go to the panelists and panel one because we have a hard stop at 3:30. So I want to make sure we hear from all of you. And then I'll go back to my council colleagues who, if they want to say a couple of opening remarks and then ask their questions, we'll give them, of course, enough time to do that. So first, in panel one, we are joined by Fatima Ahmad, who's from the Muslim Justice League, Rasan Hall from the ACLU. And is it Elizabeth and Emily who are joining us from the Justice Center? Just want to be clear, or just you, Elizabeth?
Just me for now, thanks.
Okay. And Elizabeth Badger of the Justice Center of Southeast Massachusetts. So what I will do is I will give you each about maybe 5 minutes for some opening remarks. And then I will go to council colleagues for questions or comments, and then go to the administration as well. So thank you everyone for joining.
Madam Chair, just quickly, is Shane going to send over a list of the two panels?
Yes, we'll do that. Thank you, Councilor Baker.
Okay, thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
Nope, thank you. And Shane, when you send over the names of the two panelists and who's on them, can you also make sure you share the written testimony that we got as well?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Okay, so who's going first? Fatima, is that you? Perfect, thank you.
Hello, thank you, Councilors Campbell and Arroyo, for hosting this conversation. I know so many of us are looking forward to trying to have this conversation again. I know we have attempted in the past. I am Fatima, Executive Director at Muslim Justice League, and also involved in the defund campaign that many folks witnessed last year, where a lot of these issues were highlighted. I also want to shout out Councilor Campbell, your staff person, Ellie, who has just done a fantastic job.
Thank you so much. You were so right about that.
Yeah, she has really wrangled all of these hearings and conversations about BRIC and the gang database. So really appreciate Ellie's work on this. And while I am somebody who is, impacted by policing and surveillance in certain ways, I'm someone who's probably not in the gang database. It is majority, Black and brown men who are in it. And so I really actually want to start today with showing an example of what it might look like if you were on the gang database. I will be clear, we don't know if this person is in the gang database because we don't know who's in the gang database. There is no transparency. There is no way for this person to have, after this incident gone and found out if he was harassed by a gang unit officer because of being on the database or why exactly this incident happened. I also want to share this incident because I know that the database has gotten a lot of attention from folks who are concerned about deportations. And deportations and incarceration are the worst case scenarios that happen. But there are plenty of folks in the database who are not immigrants or not undocumented folks who are impacted just day to day, who can't, walk down the street without getting harassed in this way. And this really impedes people's, day-to-day lives. They might be concerned even about accessing, social services like healthcare because of how this can impact just you walking down the street. So this video might make folks uncomfortable. There might be a little bit of language in it. I don't exactly remember the words used in it, but I think a lot of people have already seen this a couple of years ago. So I'm going to share this video and then I'll talk a little bit more about these issues of transparency and accountability.
Huh?
You're not Kevin by any chance, are you?
Kevin?
Yeah.
Nah.
Sure?
Of course.
What is your name?
Why you wanna know my name?
You look like someone I'm just looking to speak to. It's not Kevin?
Wrong person.
What's your name?
You don't need to know my name.
You can film me, it's fine. What's your name?
Of course, because I knew you guys were gonna circle around.
Yeah.
What's your name?
What's your name? It's Crossing. What's yours? Hold up,
Here
hold
we
up, hold up.
go.
Here you go.
Stage 2.
Yeah,
I already been through
1606. What's 1606? You can film it though. What's your name?
it. Why do you need to know my name? Why are you stopping me, actually?
Because we're just looking to speak to you.
I don't want to be spoken to.
What's up? What's happening?
What's up?
Okay.
Again, here we go.
Here we go.
Stage 2.
What's stage 1?
What's your name?
It's Crossing. I already told you.
And yours?
Callahan, what's up, bud?
Okay,
How you doing,
here we
man?
go.
Where do you live?
You don't need to know that.
You just out here killing
I'm
time
going
today?
to the barbershop.
You look like you just got it done.
Because I'm clean. Why you bothering me? I knew you was gonna bother me since I got out my Uber.
Yeah.
I had my camera ready.
I know you did.
Exactly. So what you stopping me for? You still ain't telling me what you're stopping me for. You still ain't telling me what you're stopping
Your parents
me
proud
for.
of you for flipping off the police?
Hey. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate you.
Have a great
This
day,
fucking stupid motherfucker.
contributor. What are you doing for work? What do you do for work? Anything?
I do a lot for work.
Like what?
stupid.
Like
I
what?
do a lot for work.
Go away.
I do a lot for
Go
fucking
away.
work.
Go away.
Fucking stupid.
Go away, tough guy.
Fucking pig.
Go away.
That's what he is.
Go away.
That's what he is.
Go away.
Stupid. Wasting time.
Make sure you
I
post this.
appreciate you.
Make sure you
Of course
post this
I'm
and
gonna
show
post
what
this
what are
shit.
you doing? It's noontime on a Thursday. What are you doing today?
And what are you doing?
I'm working.
going to the
What are you
barbershop.
doing?
You're doing the wrong fucking thing, nigga. You stopping the wrong fucking person.
Watch out, bud.
Fuck out of here. Fuck out of here. Stupid. You look stupid. You just stopped the wrong person. Wasting your own time.
Whose phone is that?
Look how stupid he is. Look how stupid he looks. Back
Go
in
away,
your fucking
clown.
car. Thank you. Fucking crazy.
Here we go.
So I know that many of us have seen that video before. If you haven't, I want to be clear that the officer in that video, as far as I know, is a gang unit officer. And so the point of showing this is that we can't talk about the gang database without also talking about the entire gang unit, right? These things are intricately tied together. And again, while we don't know in this situation if on Officer Crossan's screen inside the car, if he was actually looking at the gang database and saying, oh, this person is someone I can stop because they're on the database. We don't know, right? We have no idea. how any of that functions because we don't have that transparency. But we do know that this was a gang unit officer. And for folks who might be surprised that they're not in a police uniform, I think that is something that, you know, if you live in Dorchester, like I do in Councillor Campbell's district where this happened, you know that a lot of these police officers get to, you know, sit in a car like that, right? Not in uniform, and jump out and harass someone who is just going to the barber shop. Like, this is a day-to-day occurrence for folks. So what I want to be clear about is, at worst, we are seeing people being deported or incarcerated. And at best, we are seeing folks get harassed day to day because what exists is essentially a registry of Black and Brown people who don't know that they are on this registry and are allowed to, you know, be harassed by officers. And I think, as Rasan and Elizabeth will talk about a bit too, like, this can actually impact other areas of somebody's life without them knowing. So we've asked these questions before and we still don't have these answers, but I would love to know, like, in this case, this person actually came to some of our organizations. We talked with him after this incident. We couldn't tell him, here's how you find out if you're on the database. Here's how you get off of it. Here's how it's going to impact your life, or why this is even happening to you. As much as I want those answers, I also want to be clear that, you know, our organization, and actually pretty much all of the other organizations we work with on this issue, want an end to the database. There is no version of this that is transparent or reformed in a way that addresses the racial disparity. And these databases don't actually reduce or address violence. What they do is replicate and just, you know, perpetuate this cycle of violence, right? When we live in a city that has huge disparities in wealth between Black and white families, in healthcare, in so many things that are basic needs that folks should have access to, that's where we have to start. And we know that those things do actually address violence, and that databases like this and policing people and harassing them on the way to the barber shop, that doesn't do it. It hasn't solved it, right? Like, we already know that that hasn't been working, and we've seen other cities already shut down their databases. We as a city should not wait until the city gets sued by someone who has one of these worst case scenarios and then have to shut down the database. We need to actually address it now and make sure that we are thinking about, you know, how do we address people's basic needs and, you know, the violence of inequity that so many of us face in the city. So I'm really also grateful for Rasan and Elizabeth being here, because they are going to say so much more.
No, thank you. And I am having a 5-minute timer, but I was on mute. So thank you, Fatima. Rasan, I'll go to you. I'll start my timer. I'm keeping everyone on time since we have a hard stop, but thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Campbell, and to you, Councillor Arroyo, for this hearing today, and to all the other city councilors present. Rasan Hall, I'm director of the Racial Justice Program for the ACLU of Massachusetts. It's interesting that Fatima showed that picture or that video of Officer Zach Crossan. Recent study or analysis showed that Zach Crossan has the highest level, if not one of the highest levels of FIOs in the city of Boston. He's one of the most active. And so when you think about that type of interaction, and this is someone who worked previously in the department with young people. And so it's disturbing to see that type of interaction. In November of 2018, the ACLU filed a lawsuit after having requested public records from the Boston Police Department about the contents of its gang database. It is March 2021, and that lawsuit is still ongoing because those matters have not been resolved. We are along with several other organizations, deeply concerned about, as Fatima mentioned, the contents of that database, who is in it, how people's information is maintained in it, what type of audits are conducted, what is the efficacy underlying the rubric that is used to determine who is put into the database, who is removed from the database, the accuracy or lack of accuracy therein. It's in spirit intended to address the problem of gang violence, but we have to realize that in Boston, gang violence is not comparable to what we see in other cities like Los Angeles or Chicago or New York even. There are, from our understanding, approximately 160 documented gangs in Boston, whereas the city of Chicago, that is substantially larger, has substantially higher rates of violence attributed to gang. The population is 4 times that of Boston, has only 55 gangs. So that in and of itself raises a serious question about what is qualifying people to be considered a gang, when in fact a lot of young people are associated with a group of friends from their neighborhood, sometimes even family members. And so the data statistics have already been laid out about the number and the deep racial disparities that are in there. Half of the people in there are classified as active gang members. What does it mean to actively be a gang member when, again, these are small groupings of individuals that come together? And what does it mean to be an active gang member when you may have been FIO'd hanging out with your cousin who lives in Orchard Park, and because you're a fan of Dame Lillard, you got a Portland Trailblazer jacket on, and you're not a member of the Orchard Park Trailblazers gang, but somehow you're an active gang member according to the prerequisites or the criteria that have been established by the Boston Police Department for inclusion. In our lawsuit, we specifically asked for any documents related to the efficacy of the database. Essentially, show your work, show that the criteria that have been established have some sort of basis in research or empirical data that suggests certain indicators or criteria are have a true bearing to someone's involvement in a gang. There's nothing that controls for people aging out of so-called gang activity or criminal activity. There's ample research and studies that show at a certain period or a certain age, people are inclined to age out. That's, as far as we know, is not contemplated in any of the rubric or metrics for this gang database. There's no evidence of the effectiveness of preventing shootings or violence. We're told to trust it because police say it makes a difference. But where's the proof? Are we just going to go by the number of gun arrests that are made in the city of Boston? How many homicides have been cleared because of information contained in the gang database? And to the extent that the department can point to a certain number of homicides that have been cleared because of information from the gang database, what percentage of the overall homicides that have happened in the city have been cleared, attributed to the gang database? Does it make up 50%, 25%, 5%, 0.5%? We have no idea. I distinctly remember when I worked as an assistant district attorney for Suffolk County, sitting in brick meetings with other, and I think I heard the timer, with other law enforcement officials, having open debates about what affiliation someone has, or strategizing about how to get people's parents removed from public housing because the young person in their life is a part of a gang. This database, it compromises First Amendment rights, freedom of association. There's no evidence of how people have been stopped and surveilled based on their inclusion in these databases. There's evidence on how many people have been denied legal firearm identification cards because of inclusion in a gang database once they have moved on and gotten their lives together. Do we know how many individuals information has been referred to federal agencies because of a family member who lives in there? And to the concern, and I'll end here, about reducing violence without police, there's a research report that just came out of John Jay College that looks at non-police alternatives, and then it puts an emphasis on community-based engagement, investment in youth, addressing financial distress, dealing with physical environment and place to deal with these. Other municipalities have gone through a rigorous redefining of their criteria for the gang database. And so short of abolishing the database here in Boston, at the very least, we need to make more rigorous standards about who's getting included, the auditing process, and a purging of individuals that no longer need to be in there. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to the continued conversation and work.
Thank you, Rasan. And I'm going to go to you, Elizabeth, and then council colleagues. I'm keeping timers because of just the scheduled hearings. You're up, Elizabeth.
Councilor Campbell. Yeah, my name is Elizabeth Badger. I'm an immigration attorney. I've been working in the immigrant community in the greater Boston area for about 15 years. And for much of the last several years, I've tended to represent primarily young people with complex needs. So trauma, poor family support. And I work with community providers that help a young person, not just overcome immigration obstacles, but other, obstacles to their stability. So, through that lens, I want to respond first to the claims that databases are needed to do violence prevention work. I mean, I think, as Rasan just mentioned, we can hopefully all agree that arrest should not be even like a primary tactic for violence prevention. I mean, the evidence bears that out. And so when I hear the comment about databases being necessary to violence prevention, to me, the question that's really being asked is whether surveillance is required for community intervention, and which it absolutely isn't. I work with community providers who work with high-risk individuals like my clients, and none of them rely on database information. They rely on information they gain from having relationships with the community that they serve. And if police recognize that an individual needs intervention, they can make a direct referral to a provider. They do all the time. They don't need a database to do that. The other topic I'd like to discuss are some of the observations about the BRIC that I've made in reviewing records that the city produced to council in the Center for Law and Education versus City of Boston suit in Suffolk Superior Court, which is a suit seeking records of student data passed between BPS, BRIC, and ICE as well in the period of September 1st, 2014 to February 3rd, 2020, in which the city identified approximately 8,000 pages of communications that had transpired that included BPS student data. And to the violence prevention point, as well as I think allegations that have been made in previous hearings that those with BRIC profiles are afforded resources, I will say that, not once in any of those thousands of pages is there discussion about providing resources to an individual who's appearing in the BRIC. And that includes to victims as well, who the records demonstrate are criminalized in the BRIC once they've been victimized. Other observations from reviewing those documents, and I want to emphasize Fatima's point that, my examples may come from the immigrant community, that's my work, but they are examples of a larger problem affecting the brown and Black community, regardless of their documentation status. But first and foremost, the records show that there's a constant stream of information, photos, records, rumors, flowing between ICE and any entities connected to the BRIC, which also includes our BPS, safety services officers. The representation at some prior hearings that BRIC only sends information to ICE when there's a representation from ICE of a criminal investigation is false. The typical request for information is more along the lines of this email that I'll quote from ICE to the BRIC. Can you send me everything you have on, redacted individual? I believe he attends East Boston High. The BRIC responds, I have no BPD reports, just info from Gabe, referring to student information that Safety Services Officer Gabriel Rosa has provided to BRIC. And so that frequency that BRIC and BPD respond to ICE's phishing, would rightfully has caused the immigrant community to see BPD as a threat, rather than a source of safety. And that's something that the city needs to address. There are at least 2 analysts whose primary responsibility appears to be gathering information and rumors to send to ICE to help DHS make allegations in court to support deporting someone. And there are several other contributing analysts. And I don't believe that's how the city wants to be spending its resources. I think it's important to look at that BRIC data in the context that, on the criminal justice side, my understanding, not practicing very often in that area, is that BRIC is not regularly using, the BRIC information is not used as evidence, at least in a court. That's not to say it doesn't harm people in other areas. But in a 2018 murder trial, a former member of the BRIC and current member of the BPD homicide unit testified in Suffolk Superior Court that BRIC information is not intended to support arrests. It's not based on probable cause. So in contrast, we're using that information that our own officers acknowledge is deficient to detain and deport our immigrant community and troll people, as you saw in the video. The focus of the analyst's work, at least in the 8,000 pages covering 6 years, appears to focus on surveillance of Black and Latino children and young adults. The analysts have very close relationships, regular emailing, texting with BPS, safety services, and other affiliates. In one communication, for example, ICE emails safety services and BRIC analysts saying if they recognize a certain individual. And the safety services officer says, I know who he is. We don't have anything on him yet, still watching him. And it's my client's experiences that demonstrate that the message here that the BRIC and its affiliates will send ICE and each other, any dirt they can find on a young person as soon as they have it. And those experiences have been borne out by my clients as well. I think the BRIC also incentivizes racial profiling through its gang point system embodied in the BPD Rule 335. And from the records, it's very clear officers get the pat on the back when they provide information that contributes to a point accrual. So that what happens is that as soon as someone has a ding or a profile, their information in the BRIC, officers seem to be motivated to increase the points on a given person's profile and surveil him. And in the immigration context, my colleagues and I have seen in countless cases, as the case you cited, Counselor Campbell, where kids subject to more surveillance in schools, because they're in school, accrue more points in the BRIC that lead to their arrest, detention, sometimes deportation.
And the buzzer went off, Elizabeth. I hate your, so I'll give you a few more minutes, or
Sure.
1 more minute, I should say.
Yeah, I just want to
Yeah.
point out two briefly points. The breadth of the information sharing demonstrated by the records with the BRIC and between affiliates is seriously disturbing. There's information about many K through 8 children, monitoring of students involved in political organizing, including Black Lives Matter protests against school budget cuts. There are elevating of young Black and brown students for absurd things like a party. And as I mentioned, repeat criminalization of victims. And the information is disseminated to huge distribution lists that include judiciary, schools, police of various cities. And there's never notice or consent of the families of the students. And the last point, really briefly, I want to contextualize. So I recognize that, BPS has a new information sharing policy that went into effect after the period covered by the documents I reviewed. And, I think my colleagues believe that policy still falls short. But even if we're to assume that the SROs are no longer communicating with ICE and BRIC, the existence of the BRIC means that years of accumulated data continues to be stored and harm our communities. This example really points it out. There was a 2018 communication that didn't involve any SROs, any safety services officers. ICE asked for any information they have about someone. And BRIC analysts respond to ICE with a 2005 school report, so 13 years prior, about verbal disagreement in school that BRIC had maintained in its system. So BPS school information contained in the BRIC, at this point that evidently goes back at least 15 years, continues to harm the community. And so I would submit the city just cannot continue to support the BRIC, knowing that these are its daily operations.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And I'm going to go to my council colleagues, but just before I do, I just want to thank you guys for joining the panel. We were trying to be mindful of time and framing. We had in one meeting 9 organizations, separate organizations that have a whole host of clients that had similar examples of things that were troubling to them based on their client work. This is just a snapshot of that, given the time constraints for this particular hearing. So I just wanted to flag that. Thank you, guys. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start actually go in order of arrival now. So I'm going to go to Councillor Sabi George, Councillor Flynn, Councillor Bach, and then Councillor Arroyo.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the
And I'm timing, by the way, 5 minutes. So
Thank
I'm
you.
doing that now.
I'll try to be brief. Thank you to the panelists who've presented already. I wonder if there are other lists that are available that are utilized or that are preferable. I hesitate to say that because I understand that the idea of list making is not preferable, but I wonder if there is a better process of making any of these notations or storing any information in particular. I'm not sure who may answer that the best.
I'll let you guys decide who wants to respond. Fatima, you want to respond?
Yeah, I can just say no. Like there are no lists that are going to address the racial disparities because they are so fundamental to policing that every list ends up doing that. So like the gang database looks, it functions very similarly to say like terrorist watch lists where you have Muslim children and all sorts of Muslim folks on it who have no idea how they got on it, have no way of getting off of it. And a lot of these things just function in secrecy. I think I remember around the time of the Muslim ban, a lot of folks were saying, if there's a registry of Muslims created, I'll sign up so that, we can like protect our Muslim neighbors. But the reality is these lists already exist and they already impact people's daily lives. And our city is not reducing violence because of any of that. Like we know
what are the other lists that exist in different, whether it's city or state agencies that there's concerns about?
I think many cities have gang databases. Some are run by city police, some are run by state police. In this case, Boston is actually really unique in that we have this fusion center. So BRIC is an unusual thing for us to have.
Are there other agencies though that have a list? I'm trying to understand if there are lists in addition to the gang database that exist, that are being utilized, whether it's through Boston Police or through other agencies.
I don't know because again, so many of them function in secrecy that we wouldn't know. So I don't know if the Massachusetts state level, if the state police have their own database or if the State Fusion Center has a database. Rasan and Elizabeth, I don't know if y'all know of any other lists that we know of that already function, but I will say, even just by that interaction you saw in that video, you don't always need a physical list, right? Like you have a lot of officers who know people. We even 3 years ago city council had a hearing about the surveillance practices of BPD, and we had a young person who wanted to testify but was afraid because he gets harassed by the police so often. And he said, I don't know how they know my name and where I go to school, but they show up all of the time. So I think there, we know about this gang database because it's come out through these really extreme cases of deportation. So there's just a lack of transparency, right? We have no idea how a lot of this works.
Is anyone else aware of other lists of potential concern or lists that exist that might be utilized?
There is other intersecting databases, right? This is a fusion center. So I know that I often see reference to CopLink. I think Cade Crawford at the ACLU would be like the best person to answer questions about other similar concerning lists.
Is there anything through, I thought I recalled through some of the conversations we had, amongst government officials, elected officials, that there was a list that was maybe being compiled by the district attorney's office that was, I think, was maybe trying to improve some of the practices of the gang database. So I'm wondering if that is something that exists that was sort of mentioned. I don't know it, and that's what I'm trying to understand is if there are other things that we should be additionally focused on or reviewing or concerned about.
I'm not sure, but on the flip side, I'll reiterate that,
Right.
when community programs work with the community and their client base, their information is what supports violence prevention. They don't need to share that
Right.
with law enforcement, and that is what the evidence proves is most effective.
That's it. I may have additional questions later in this hearing. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councilor Sabi George. Councilor Flynn.
Thank you, Councilor Campbell, and thank you to the panelists and the next panel of administration that will also be here. I just have one question. Maybe Rasheen might be able to answer it. What is the process of?
Rasan.
I'm sorry, Rashawn.
That's all good.
Um,
I'm correcting here.
Okay.
ahead.
What is the process of if someone is on the brick that shouldn't be on the brick? What would the process be to get off the brick if they shouldn't be on it? Is there a procedure that you have to follow to request that your name not be added for various reasons?
I think that's just the problem, is there is a complete lack of transparency around what type of process there even is, or whether or not a person can find out if they are included in the gang database. So there, ideally there would be some sort of process where you can check and see you are listed in the gang database. Here is how you appeal your presence in this database. Nothing like that exists as far as we know.
And I'll just say, Councilor Flynn, that is one of the questions based on some information we've received, as well as myself, for the administration and panel too.
Okay. I guess my final question. Is I know that database would not be able to be used during a trial, but is it used during any other phase of the process?
Sure. From my own experience as a prosecutor, the decision as to whether or not to present a case to the grand jury for something that may seem like a low-level offense. I remember we did an operation where we indicted people, not charged complaints in district court, but filed indictments in superior court for marijuana distributions because we had gang intel that folks were involved in gangs. And then later, after we executed the program or executed the warrants from that operation, I had community people coming to me saying, y'all got the wrong people. These aren't the people who are the problems in the community. So, but gang intelligence says that these individuals were involved in gangs, right? So, and whether or not that comes directly from the gang database, that's my belief based on the group of officers that I was working with. But it wasn't introduced at trial saying this individual was in the gang database, but the decision to indict someone and bring a case before the superior court was largely informed by a belief of alleged gang affiliation.
Rasan, can you share, is that an official policy that you all were going by that pushes prosecutors to do that through the DA's office? Because we've heard similar concerns, but we haven't been able to find, here is how folks know that this is what they're supposed to do.
Yeah, that's that's not a written policy. That's just the practice of the office. How are we going to get our hooks into people, even if it's for a small case? If we charge them with something, we'll get them on probation. They'll be bound to screw up on probation, and we can, have probation officers go into their home. But there's no written policy about that. At least not when I was in the office. I don't know if those things have changed, but I doubt it. And for what it's worth, we've sent public records requests to all 11 DA's offices and haven't seen any policies that indicate something like that exists.
Thank you. And I guess my last question, I know it was mentioned earlier, I didn't hear the answer completely, but what cities across the country do maintain a database? Major cities that do maintain a database, and do we know why they maintain a database?
I think there's, LA, Chicago, New York, I believe Portland, Rhode Island. Some of those very departments have refined their criteria for who goes in the gang database after similar critiques about the huge racial disparities and the lack of transparency in those systems.
I'm just wondering, Madam Chair, if sometime down the road, if we're able to get a update on major cities in the country that have a database, what is the process for people that are on the database, their process to get off the database?
Yep.
Whether there's some type of an appeal or working within the criminal justice system, but it might be helpful just to learn a little bit about what other cities are doing too.
Thank you, Councillor Flynn. I'm going to go to Councillor Bach and then Councillor Royal.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. And I have to apologize. I am meant to be jumping to another thing. So I'll just make some brief remarks. And I've got staff on and we'll review the whole tape. I really grateful to the advocates and also to the department. I know they haven't gone yet, but for being here. I think I just want to add my voice to say, I raised with the department many months ago that same Diaz case that you quoted from. And I think I'm just, and have articulated that I'm very concerned. At the most minimal level with the idea that folks can be in our database based purely on FIOs. I just think that criminalizes being from a neighborhood too easily. And I don't think that's something that we would be that we should ever be comfortable with. I think it's something that would have ensnared a heck of a lot more Italian American and Irish American kids in the Boston of 50 years ago in the criminal justice system. And I think it's doing that now to our Black and brown youth, and that we need to back way off of that. So that's important to me. And I know that when we talked to the department in the fall, they were saying that they were sort of working on internal norms to kind of make it so that people couldn't be in the database purely on FIOs, sort of in response to that case. I think what I would say back to that is it needs to not just be informal policy, it needs to be an actual codified rigid policy on that front. But also I think we should go further. And I think that, to the points the advocates have raised, to me, the question about having a database like this has to start with the presumption that we shouldn't have it because of the way that it makes, folks in our community feel surveilled, the way that it turns people from kind of the residents who are being served by the police to being the suspects sort of automatically. I think the whole orientation to the department gets shifted for people who have their name on a list. And so I think you have to start philosophically from there, that this is something that we should be pretty averse to, and then really have this bar for justifying what are the specific instances where we really think something clears a bar and there's a huge assistance to public safety and it's measurable and it's reviewable and it's transparent, right? I think we just have to have a really, really high bar on this, because my concern is just, and I've said this in a lot of surveillance contexts, but just that our instinct in this country is to keep tabs on people because we can, and more we can to a ridiculous extent. Right. And so I think it's our job as civilian democratic governance actors to kind of pull back on that instinct. and really say, no, like more knowledge is not necessarily good if what it does is sort of turn our residents and members of the community into instead subjects of the surveillance. So I appreciate, like, I also read a bunch of the correspondence you mentioned from folks who point out the ways that this has been helpful, and specifically helpful to community groups that want to intervene in the lives of our young people and help support them and meet many of the needs that our society's not meeting. And so I think, like, I'm definitely open to that conversation about targeted, but really tailored things along these lines. But I think it seems to me, based on what I've heard, not just today, but also in conversations with the department, like we're not really at that tailored place yet. So as I said, I'm really sorry that I'm not able to stay past the 2:30 mark, but I have staff on the line and we'll be following this closely, and really appreciate you, Madam Chair, and also Councilor Arroyo for convening the conversation today.
Thank you, Councilor Bach. Councilor Arroyo.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'm just going to leap, thank you to everybody, but I'm just going to leap right into questions on this. For Mr. Hall, I think the number one issue that I have with this, amongst many other issues, it's systemically racist, it's racially profiling. It actually promotes racial profiling because you're actually going to communities to then associate within those communities. It's how this works. It's almost like a pyramid scheme of racial profiling and gang membership. But when we talk about due process, which I'm very, I think constitutional rights aren't technicalities. And I think when we do this work, our job is to actually ensure that we're not infringing on constitutional rights. And Black and Latino men, because there's only 26 women on this list out of 5,000, deserve their constitutional rights as well. And so when we talk about that, let me ask you this question, since you were a prosecutor. Have you ever seen, are you familiar with the term test a line?
Yes.
What is that term, just for folks who don't know?
It's when officers testify, curate their testimony in a way that meets the objective of either the motion that's being argued or makes out the prima facie elements of a claim or of a case.
In your experience as a prosecutor, did that ever happen?
Yes.
In Boston?
Yes.
Did you ever see an officer prosecuted for testifying? Did we ever have a perjury charge for an officer in Boston?
Not that I'm aware of.
And so when we talk about due process, test the line usually comes about because they write a police report, correct?
Oftentimes a police report or their recollections.
And then some direct evidence, whether it's a video, whether it's an eyewitness testimony, actually shows conclusively that police report was falsified?
Yes.
Okay. And so the reason that we ever find that out is because we have the due process right to a trial, to challenge these reports, to challenge these statements, correct?
If it's ever found out, that's one of the places it happens.
Are you aware of any whistleblower situation where some officer reported some other officer lied in a trial?
None come to mind immediately.
Okay, so basically the reason I say this is if you end up on an FIO, so I write the report and I say, I saw Rasan Hall hanging out with Ricardo Arroyo and he's with the Boston City Council gang, so that's this. And I do that. Do you ever, as the system set up now, do you, Rasan Hall, ever receive notice of that?
No.
Do you ever get the chance to challenge whether or not you actually were in my presence or in an area with me or in a vicinity with me?
Not at all.
Okay, and so when you are making charging decisions as a prosecutor and you're told this person's a gang associate, when they provide you this, it was still based off of a point system similar to what we use now?
It depends. Sometimes it's people, just officers with their own knowledge of it. But if they were saying this person is in the gang database, that would be from someone having met the criteria of the point system used.
And so it's possible, for instance, that there's a reality in which some FIOs, because we can't challenge them, we're unable to actually verify their veracity.
Correct.
And so there's a possibility that if officers in Boston have lied under oath, which I think the Boston Globe did a whole piece on this just last month. It's headlined, "When Boston Police Officers Fail to Tell the Truth. The Department Rarely Calls a Lie a Lie." and they actually detailed 2 instances of this. But we know that's the case. We know that we have falsified police reports in Boston, correct? We've seen that.
Yes.
Does it stand to reason then that we should expect that some FIOs can also be falsified?
It absolutely can, that they've been falsified, but also that people are genuinely mistaken and someone has been misidentified as being in a certain location because an officer believes that this person that they're looking at is someone who they think it is, just like you saw in that video with Officer Zach Crossan, who said, "Is your name Kevin?" Because he believed that he was Kevin. Now, whether that was a ruse or not, but if he was entering information into the gang database based on some Kevin person, which that's not that young man's name, then that's another way, and separate and apart from officers lying, which happens as well.
How does the courts, and I know the answer to this, but I think it's enlightening for others. How does our court system treat cross-racial identification?
It's come under significant scrutiny now.
Is there data in science that shows that cross-racial identifications are actually often more unreliable and mistaken?
Yes.
Okay. And then just really quickly for Ms. Badger, you work on immigration proceedings, correct?
Correct.
And often these gang database reports can show up in immigration proceedings.
Very often.
There's no rules of evidence for immigration, correct? It's separate from a criminal court case?
Very few. Additionally, like immigration judges don't have jurisdiction to rule on constitutional issues if we were to raise a due process violation, for instance.
So let me just ask you this. People, I think, understand that when I'm charged with a crime, the burden is on
30 seconds.
Thank you. This will be quick. When I'm charged with a crime, the burden is on the government to prove that crime in a criminal district court or in a criminal superior court, or it's the burden's on them. When you're in a immigration proceeding and you're presented police reports or you're presented gang database reports, is the burden still on the government, or at that point, because it's immigration court, does it shift to the actual client of yours to prove innocence rather than guilt?
The burden is on the immigrant to disprove anything that has been alleged in those reports, which is next to impossible.
Thank you. That's it for me on this round. Thank you.
No, thank you, Councilor Roy. And that last point is a major distinction as someone who represented young students who are undocumented in immigration cases on a pro bono basis, right? Because you're not entitled to an attorney. It's a great distinction to make. I'm going to now go to Councilor Baker, and then from Councilor Baker, I go to Councilor Mejia, Councilor Flaherty, Councilor Wu, Councilor Braden. Councilor Baker, starting timer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a couple points. So Eddie had asked about, well, Councilor Flynn had asked about what cities have databases. There was a point made that some cities have shut down their database. Do we have a sense of who has straight out shut down their databases?
Northern Virginia has gotten rid of their regional task force. Cook County has dramatically curtailed theirs, as same with Los Angeles.
Cook County in Chicago, Rashid?
Yes. Rasan, the H is silent.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
I would say additionally, CalGang, the California gang system, has eliminated any contact with ICE as part of it, as a legislative matter.
So just a limited shutdown. They're not.
They've done significant revision, including having community oversight.
Yeah. So on the deportation, how many people have been deported based on BRIC information, gang database information in the last 3 or 4 years? Do we have that number?
We do not have that number. More than should have been would be my answer. Many.
But we have no idea how many have been?
No, because there's been no the lack of transparency in the system. We can't know how many individuals were sent to DHS with evidence. I will say there is a very recent ACLU document production on that maybe in a few weeks we could have a better answer.
That would be interesting to see. And also there was mention of, I don't know if you would call them conversions on murder cases or like how involved has a database been involved in that? We're unable to show that they are effective but we're also unable to show that they're not effective. Would that be a safe statement?
I think that would be a really good question for the administration, because yeah, I think as Elizabeth said, we're trying to get this data, and essentially we're all working backwards. Like, we've had people get deported, and then we found out about the gang database through their court proceedings and worked backwards. But, you know, we'd really love to get that information directly from the BRIC. And I believe that Portland, Oregon shut down its entire gang database. There may be one other city that like completely shut it down as well. But we could, I think the ACLU probably has a report of all of that we could share with you all.
Okay, and I think I'm probably polar opposite of where Councilor Arroyo was. He's looking for an abolition of the database. I'm not looking for an abolition. I believe that there's value in this. Maybe it's not perfect, but I'm not looking to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I'll listen to the administration. I'm interested to see what they have to say. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councilor Baker. Councilor Mejia.
Wait 1 second, Annalise. Yes, thank you. So I think I really don't have any questions specifically for the advocates, because we know what we know. It's quite clear this conversation has been going on for a long time, even before I stepped into this position. And so having worked in the education advocacy space, I have seen the impact from a youth perspective on what it feels like to be labeled and identified and harassed, and the social and emotional impact that has on young people in terms of how they see themselves. And just that constant fear of walking out your home and never knowing whether or not you're gonna be the next victim to get stopped and harassed. I mean, just watching that video, I'd already seen it before, but just the level of disregard and disrespect for people is what, for me, I think is something that goes to show that when we have systems like this in place, that people tend to abuse their power to some extent. And I think that is really problematic for me. I am curious though, as we start thinking about this conversation, and while there are some folks who don't agree that abolishing may be the best course of action, I do believe that there is, and to what we have already heard, some really deep systemic flaws in the current structure, right? And it's obviously the people who have been profiled are usually Black or Latinx and you know, primarily people of color. And so Boston, knowing the history and the racism that exists here, if there's a way for us to really have a heart-to-heart with folks and realizing that this gang base is creating, deeper systemic racism, then let's get rid of it. It's not serving its purpose, right? And if the purpose really is to protect and serve, let's think about what that looks like in ways that don't feel like you are profiling or attacking certain individuals, right? So I think that protect and serve sentiment needs to really feel like everyone feels protected and served. And you don't get to choose who it is that you're going to protect or serve, and you shouldn't have the right to choose who you're going to profile. And I know, if based on some of the things that I just heard in terms of like the young people who are out here protesting, I know with my loud mouth, and I know how I be rolling up in all of these spaces, I'm sure I'm probably on that list too, right? I wouldn't even doubt that I'm one of those folks that would be considered problematic. And I think it's important for us to realize when we're infringing on people's rights to protest, people's rights to publicly come and go. And I think that this also, to me, sounds and feels like a matter of civil rights in many ways. And I think that there is an intersection here that we need to explore. And while I don't have any questions specifically for those who have already spoken, because they have already said what they've needed to say hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times over, I think we know what we know. And I think the question is what are we going to do about it? And how we're going to come to some resolution where people feel like restorative justice has been played and that young people can feel free to walk the streets and not worry about being the next person that gets rolled up on. I think that that is where the energy needs to be at. And I think it's not about pointing fingers. It's not about, you know, this is not, I'm not a lawyer. This is not, I'm not a judge. I'm not any of those things. So I'm not here to say bad police, but I do think that we have some very, very, very bad practices within the Boston Police Department. And I think that this is one of them that I believe we need to lean in. And if there's one thing that we could do by focusing some energy on this, then that's where what we should all be advocating for. And so I appreciate you all. I'm going to reserve my questions for the administration because I think that that is where the energy needs to be at. And not to say that the energy with y'all wasn't important because y'all brought in some really good data and information, but I'm just like, I'm already in agreement with all of the things that you all have said. So thank you for being here.
Thank you, Councilor Mejia. Councilor Flaherty. Councilor Wu. Councilor Brady.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to all the advocates for participating in this really important discussion this afternoon. Many of my colleagues have already asked the questions that I had. You know, one of the big concerns I have is that we really seem to be criminalizing normal teenage behavior in many cases, and that you know, and that we seem to have different standards for how we treat our Black and brown youth compared to white kids. So it's sort of shocking when I heard the numbers about the number of identified documented gangs in Boston is 160, and that the number of documented gangs in Chicago, which has got a notorious reputation for gang activity, is 40. So I think that begs the question, are we criminalizing and not unnecessarily criminalizing a large group of young people? And it's just, I'm trying to get my head around this. Also, in terms of non-police alternatives, I'd be interested to hear if there are models that you folks have researched or come across that point to non-police alternatives that other municipalities are using instead of having a gang database. Thank you.
Yeah, I think one of the, actually I believe it's 55 gangs in Chicago, 55 or 59, but whatever, it's still not 160. As far as alternative, non-police alternatives, if you look at the violence interrupters in Chicago, there's the Cure Violence program as well. And the other thing that comes from the John Jay report is really, you know, looking at greater investments in longitudinal research to get best outcomes, because it's one thing to say, let's use non-police alternatives to disrupt violence in community and say, we'll throw a couple street workers on the street, but then when violence doesn't seem to move, the needle doesn't seem to move, people say, well, we can't do that. That didn't work. We just need to keep going with the police. When in fact, there hasn't been the significant investment, and there hasn't been an investment in the research to find out what are the touch points within that system, within those programs and initiatives that really have the best outcomes. But there are other studies that show the greater investment in non-police violence intervention programs correlates to decreases in incidents of violence, and the cities that have the higher investment have those better results. So I think that's something for us to keep in mind, in addition to dealing with substance use disorder and dealing with, again, place and space. What are the open and green areas that people have? What are the investments that are being made in young people? What are the initiatives that are created to address financial crisis that sometimes leads to these situations as well?
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. That's all I have for now.
Thank you, Councilor Braden. I'm now going to go, and thank you all. I'm going to go now to the administration. We have Superintendent Charles Wilson, Deputy Superintendent Kenneth Gaines, David Carabin, who's the director of the BRIC, and I believe Rufus Falk is also on. I'm not sure, are all of you planning on testifying? Is that the case?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so David, do you want to start?
Yes, I'll go ahead
Okay.
and I'll get this started. Everything, sound check, everything's clear?
So, yes, and what I'll do is I'll do the 5-minute timer for you guys each, like I did with the other panelists. And one thing I do want to say that would be important based on questions I'm sure would come from colleagues is just obviously the database, how do you get into it? Just that basic information that no one really knows, criteria, et cetera, would be helpful to hear from you guys too.
All right, respectfully, Counselor, I just ask for us all to be allowed to get through our testimony, and I promise you that those answers will be provided.
Oh, absolutely. Perfect. Go right ahead.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Carabin. I serve as the Assistant Chief of Boston Police Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Analysis and the Director of the Boston Regional Intelligence Center. The BRIC's mission is to serve as the region's central point for the collection, synthesis, analysis, and dissemination of strategic and tactical intelligence to law enforcement, first responders, and private sector partners. It is a resource that supports the city's public safety responsibilities by analyzing, maintaining, sharing information in a manner that protects our communities and protects the privacy, civil rights, and civil liberties of our citizens. All major organizations formulate business decisions based on the analysis of data and information relevant to their operational requirements. This is true for major private sector businesses, and it's true for police agencies such as Boston Police Department. The BRIC facilitates a large majority of the Boston Police Department's analytic requirements. BRIC personnel analyze lawfully obtained information to identify crime patterns and trends, anomalies in criminal activity, indicators of violence and illegal offenses, and prolific offenders. They evaluate threat information and investigate criminal offenses. The BRIC assists BPD's response to active crime incidents and investigations and is responsible for providing situational awareness on matters that could impact police operations and public safety across the city and the region. For the purposes of this hearing, I want to point out that one of the BRIC's most significant analytic responsibilities is focused on violent criminal offenses to include firearm offenses, homicides, aggravated assaults, and robberies. These crimes are frequently perpetrated by individuals associated with violent street gangs. Analysis within this portfolio focuses on gang feuds, criminal offenses perpetrated by gangs, tactics used to facilitate criminal activity and avoid law enforcement detection, catalysts that exacerbate retaliatory violence between gangs, and the likely targets and locations of retaliatory violence. The intelligence gleaned from this analysis is used to advise police deployments to prevent violence, support investigations, reduce the inherent risks to the community, and to ensure the safety of our police officers and other first responders. This intelligence is also shared and used to inform numerous city agencies and nonprofit health and human service organizations that provide services to individuals and families assessed to be most at risk of being victimized by or perpetrators of violence. Intelligence produced by the BRIC is typically restricted from public disclosure in order to protect the privacy rights of victims, witnesses, and individuals reasonably suspected of or charged with criminal offenses, and to protect the sensitivities of ongoing law enforcement investigations and security plans. The protection of such information is done in accordance with state and federal law, local ordinances, and department policy, and BRIC personnel are trained accordingly. The vast majority of information and data used for analysis comes from internal police reporting mechanisms, lawfully collected police data sources, and intelligence shared by other law enforcement agencies in accordance with law and policy. Other information and data used is collected from publicly available sources. Analysts in the BRIC rely on a variety of technologies to support their responsibilities. Our selection and application of technology is the result of identified best practices nationally and laws, policies, guidance, and recommendations from the U.S. Department of Justice and other nationally recognized organizations. The majority of technologies used by the BRIC are for managing, querying, analyzing, annotating, and visualizing qualitative data and relational data sets. Databases maintained by the BRIC are done so to improve the quality of our analysis, This ultimately helps avoid the circulation of arbitrary, subjective information and prevents ill-informed decision-making. The BPD's gang assessment database is one such technology. The gang database has a defined purpose and operates according to strict policy. It is intended to provide Boston Police Department with a consistent framework citywide for identifying individuals and groups that associate as a gang and thus are likely to engage in or perpetrate criminal activity for the furtherance of the criminal organization, which may include targeted and/or retaliatory violence. Under all circumstances, information is thoroughly scrutinized and analyzed before being submitted to the database. There is no automated technology or process that places individuals in the database. Let me repeat that. There is no automated technology or process that places anyone into the database. No individual will be considered for addition to the gang database on the basis of their religion, political or social views or activities, their participation in a particular non-criminal organization or lawful event, or their race, ethnicity, citizenship, place of origin, age, disability, gender, or sexual orientation. The information is only shared for official law enforcement purposes, or as previously referenced, with service provider agencies under specific terms and conditions and with formalized legal agreements to reduce the risks associated with traumatic violent behavior. Immigration and Customs Enforcement does not have access to the database and never has had access to the database. Consistent with the City of Boston Trust Act, information contained within the database may only be shared with ICE to further a criminal investigation. And information from the department can never be shared to support civil immigration proceedings. The information contained within the gang database has an operational shelf life, and as such, the information undergoes a routine retention review process supported by timers associated with the data to inform of a record reaching its retention limit. This triggers a process in which data is analyzed to determine its relevance for purge or extension. This is based specifically upon a trained analyst or supervisor's reasonable suspicion supported by recent data and information that an individual remains engaged and associated with a group that is participating in criminal activity and/or retaliatory violence. A few important points to make about the data.
I just want to acknowledge, David, the buzzer went off, so maybe one more minute, and then I'm going to go to the other panelists.
Ma'am, I got to finish to answer your questions.
To answer what questions?
A few very important
To answer
points.
what questions?
The questions that were raised leading into this whole hearing. You guys have questions, I'm about to answer them all.
No, so this is what the plan is. The plan was to give every single. Excuse me?
Okay, go ahead.
I think we maybe want to take a deep breath. I'm just giving everyone 5 minutes. That's what I said. We said this before we started the panel, or I'm sorry, the hearing. Everyone has 5 minutes. So you, along with all the other folks in the administration, have 5 minutes to give opening statements. And then I'm going to go through counselors like I did with the first panel to have them ask questions. So I'm timing everyone. Your buzzer went off. So if you want to wrap up in 1 minute, then I can go to Superintendent Wilson and the other folks from the administration. Unless Superintendent Wilson wants to give you his 5 minutes.
No, I don't think that's necessary. So I'll continue and you can let me know when my time is up then. So a few very important points to make about the data in the gang database. The BRIC does not name these groups. Rather, these are the names that their membership or associates use as their moniker. In many cases, the BRIC does not define who associates with these groups. Rather, the individuals make up the group's membership, claim association with these groups, and openly advise of this. In other words, their claim of association to a specific gang is not done covertly. Not only is this publicized by groups in publicly available information sources such as YouTube and Instagram videos, but this is learned through BPD's community engagement with these groups and investigative interactions, and upon their registration during intake at correctional facilities. Otherwise, we use the verification process detailed. The City Council in its written order for this hearing states that Black and brown.
So I'm going to go now to Superintendent Wilson. I'm timing everyone. Nothing's changed since the beginning of this hearing. So
But they spoke for 10 minutes at a time.
Excuse
Okay.
me? I did
Spoke for
5
about 10
minutes.
minutes each.
Okay. Superintendent Wilson, you have 5 minutes. I'll put the timer on and then I'll go to Rufus. I'm sorry, I'll go to Superintendent Wilson. And then I will go to Deputy Superintendent Kenneth Gaines, and then I'll go to Rufus.
That's fine. Okay.
Superintendent, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. No, that's fine. So what Dave Carabin didn't get a chance to mention is that we're working off the same microphones to avoid feedback. So you can't see me, but I'm here.
And we can hear you.
Thank you, thank you. So the Boston Police Department worked closely with the City Council and supported the revised Trust Act in its entirety. Working with the Council on the gang assessment database is as equally important. Restricting the use and dissemination of intelligence data, particularly to our service provider partners, will have a profound effect on their ability to identify youth at risk, deconfliction for safety of their participants, and design programs to meet the needs of the community they serve. The people that support the BPD and the use of the gang database are recognized leaders in the Black and brown communities of Boston who do street outreach and place youth at risk in programs that benefit the person and the community. You know them. They are the folks that actually do the work. Our partners have written letters of support for us because the gang database is designed to support their programs. The Boston Police Department will never turn a partner away and does and will continue to accept constructive criticism to make the gang database better. This includes all of you. Every member of the City Council has my cell number. I have personally met with some of you and spoke with every member of the council for one reason or another. We invited you to police headquarters several months ago during a very difficult time in our country's history, and every councilor was represented. Later, at your request, we invited representatives from your panel to attend a working group meeting to discuss our proposed changes to the gang database. Your advocates declined. We have made no concessions to the changes in the rule, which is now in its final draft, because we listened to what our partners had to say and agreed with them. We will continue to listen, so please call us. I would like to now read in some snippets of some support letters that you have received, and starting with Mayor Walsh. This administration has been committed since my first days in office to eliminating violence from our communities by addressing it at its roots, reducing poverty, systemic racism, increasing equity in education, public health, economic opportunity, healing individual, familial, and community trauma, and providing individuals with supportive pathways out of criminal activity and gang affiliation. In short, as I have said many times, we are devoted to lifting people up, not locking people up. We advance these values using innovative, evidence-based strategies through wide-ranging community partnerships led by city departments, including the Office of Health and Human Services, the Office of Public Safety, the SOAR Boston Street Worker Program, and the Centers of Youth and Families, the Neighborhood Trauma Teams and the Boston Public Health Commission, the Office of Returning Citizens, the Office of Workforce Development, and the Boston Public Schools. This comprehensive and community-centered partnership strategy is essential for understanding the work of the Boston Police Department's Boston Regional Intelligence Center, otherwise known as the BRIC, and the purpose of its gang assessment database. Violence in Boston is driven by gang dynamics with a very small number of people causing a disproportionate amount of harm. The purpose of the database is to investigate and prevent violence, harm, and associated trauma in our neighborhoods. In addition, the information in the database helps our other city agencies and social service providers identify at-risk individuals for services, support, and crisis intervention. And then, of course, I'm just reading snippets here, so I'll skip down to, in summary, the Boston Police Department's gang assessment database is a critical tool in the city's strategy, not only for responding to violent criminal activity, but also for supporting at-risk young people, preventing community violence and victimization, and offering participants safe and healthy pathways to a better life. That is from Mayor Martin Walsh. The next letter I have before the council is from Rachel Rollins. You should all have it. It arrived a few minutes after the hearing started, but you all should have it in your inboxes. Again, I'm only going to read snippets. It's a rather lengthy letter. Skipping to, as district attorney, I'm committed to finding ways to work smarter using a data-driven approach in our efforts to keep the city of Boston and its entirety of Suffolk County safe. As we develop new techniques to support and develop safer neighborhoods, it is clear that data-driven investigations and prosecutions are essential to our work. The Boston Regional Intelligence Center is one of those law enforcement partners, allowing us to use data as a smart and informed approach to identifying those driving the violence. Data provided by the BRIC is one of the number of sources prosecutors in my office use to address the needs of a particular community or neighborhood. I also think it's important to provide a brief overview of the manner that the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office uses data provided by the BRIC to inform our team in their efforts to provide safety and services to the people of Boston and Suffolk County as a whole. Skipping a little ahead.
I just want to say the buzzer went off, Superintendent.
All right, I'll try to wrap this up. Andrea, thank you.
Because I've shared, if you're reading all the letters, I've shared all of that. We will also make them available publicly, of course.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I wasn't sure if that would be available publicly.
Absolutely. Everything that is submitted will be made available publicly.
Okay, thank you. So if I could just skip ahead, if I'm allowed, another 60 seconds, perhaps. There are other people, and I'll just kind of do a quick overview. There are people from the Boston Medical Center who work with us closely to identify people for deconfliction purposes in their violence intervention advocacy program. There's also people from Project Right who supported us. There are also people from ROCA that supported us. And other service providers have committed to making direct calls to council members. At this point, I can turn it over to Rufus Falk, Director of the Mayor's Office of, I'm sorry, we're going to Deputy Gaines, aren't we?
Yep, so thank you. I just want to acknowledge two things. So one, I said this in the beginning, all letters that we received in support of either the database or the BRIC or the value of it will be shared. But one of the things that was clear, and this will be one of my questions later on, is that everyone acknowledged there were still racial disparities and something that needed to be fixed. So I want to stress that because I think it's important, the topic and subject matter for this hearing. And the other point, Superintendent, I have to go on the record on is the advocates didn't decline to meet. They wanted to meet, they just didn't want to do it in person at BPD in the midst of COVID. They wanted to do it virtually via Zoom, and the department said no. So I think it's important to stress that because the meeting actually still happened. And of course, we stayed in contact and will. So I will go to Superintendent Gaines, then I will go to Rufus, and then I will go to counselors for questions for the administration.
Good afternoon, can you hear me?
Deputy Superintendent, we can hear you. Thank you for being here.
My name is Kenneth Gaines. I'm a Deputy Superintendent of the Field Support Division, which the Youth Violence Strike Force falls under. The Youth Violence Strike Force's mission is to reduce gun violence, particularly concentrating on individuals affiliated with gangs or violent criminal behavior. The Youth Violence Strike Force utilizes traditional policing strategies, incorporating prevention, intervention, and enforcement efforts. Information is collected to focus on sources of firearm and gang violence through the identification of individuals, groups, and locations. The officers receive information on individuals and activity from a multitude of different sources. It could be observations that they make. It could be information from other officers, information from confidential informants, and oftentimes it's from members of the community. The officer will verify this information, and if they deem it to be credible, will submit it to the BRIC for further review and verification. The information in the gang database is an investigative tool which can help with officer and community safety. It provides officers with information and is a strong investigative tool dealing with firearm violence. I can, 4 recent investigations come to mind where approximately 50 firearms were seized and some individuals were taken into custody with violent histories, and that's 50 firearms that won't have any victims attached to it. Our goal is not necessarily to arrest, but it's to build rapport with these individuals that we're interacting with. And, if we can get them out of that lifestyle and deal with our community partners and offer them services, with jobs, counseling, or whatever they need for success, that's what we would rather do as opposed to arresting individuals. But the reality is a small percentage, they're not going to accept help and they're going to continue to engage in violent activity. And that is where enforcement is necessary at times. I mean, our goal is to make the city of Boston safer from gun violence.
Thank you, Deputy Superintendent. Rufus, I'm going to go to you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to council and also to the previous panel. I'm going to be brief. I had some points that I wanted to make, but I sort of threw those out the window just to say that I think we all could recognize both sides of this sort of debate. Being a Black man born and raised in Roxbury, I understand emphatically the optics of it. Being in this role as a director of public safety, I also have to deal with the other side of getting those phone calls when 95 to 100% of the men harmed by gun violence or murdered, or young women murdered by gun violence, look like us on this call. And the work of violence prevention in this space is about trying to be intentional about the services that we're delivering, about the communities in which we're serving. And most times that data is driven by, whether it be shot spotter activation, whether it be driven by individuals who are returning from incarceration, from individuals who are portraying a lifestyle that they might not. Just to sort of give some anecdotal, we had incidents with young individuals between the ages of 16 and 19 portraying a role on social media that they were not playing in reality, but because of the imagery that they were putting out, made themselves more susceptible to be harmed by gun violence. It was our duty to make sure that we can intervene with that group of juveniles as quickly as possible, because the last thing we want to do is show up to a scene, have to deal with a mother, deal with a family, and they're asking us how we didn't do more sooner. I've been going to funerals for peers since 1995. I was 13, I'm 39 years old, I haven't taken a year off. So I acknowledge the optics. I'm a student of history. I recognize what it's like to have a list of Black and brown kids making up the majority of that list. But I also know on the other end, I know that the majority of homicide victims are also Black and brown. So we have to find what that meeting point is. So I'm just here as someone who providing a little bit of context for the work that we're doing, whether it be with our trauma teams, whether it be with our outreach teams, whether it be in my office, whether it be initiatives like Operation Exit, where we're targeting those individuals. Yes, I'm saying targeting individuals most likely to harm someone or be harmed by gun violence, to try to transition them into a career path, recognizing that having that career path, having that second chance, and being intentional about who we select can have a ripple effect on the sort of climate of gun and gang violence within the city. And I just the last point, I think it's an important distinction to make, that the gang culture in Boston is unlike any other gang culture in the nation. We are a home of street gangs. We're not a home of these national gangs that might represent Chicago and Los Angeles. These are street gangs, some historic, some are more active than not, some have gone defunct, some are being revisited. And that in itself has sort of widened the map in terms of how many self-identified young folks are claiming gang activity. But again, I know what it was like to be 16 and wear a hat that may have represented my neighborhood or may not have represented my neighborhood, and not wanting to be caught in those trappings, recognizing how there's a stigma attached to being gang involved. But we're trying to do on our side, Office of Public Safety and some of the partners on here, doing our best to try to help individuals transition out of that lifestyle. So I think about BPD, I think about Deputy Superintendent Gaines, who just spoke, and he has been a major partner in some of the work that we're doing, just in terms of trying to be strategic about putting resources where they need to go. So those are my comments. I will be quiet and ready to answer any questions if levied. Thank you.
Thank you, Rufus. I'll start with just a few, and I'm going to time myself and then go to council colleagues. One is just around the racial inequities. One, does the department even acknowledge that racial inequities exist in the gang database? Two, if so, and I think the mayor spoke to this in his letter that he sent, that they exist, but if so, what is the city and department doing to ensure that those disparities don't continue to exist? And then my last question is on the accountability piece. When we do find out that an individual has been harmed because of misinformation, what is the process or strategy to allow that person to seek some accountability from the department? So those are my three questions for now.
Counselor, I will state Carabin again. I will start by answering kind of in reverse. Since around 2012, the BRIC issued a privacy, civil rights, and civil liberties protection policy. It is a requirement for our existence as a major urban area fusion center. And just of note, there are 80 other, or maybe 81 other fusion centers like the BRIC nationwide, so we are not an anomaly. Our privacy policy is posted publicly within that privacy, and that's on the BPD News website. It's been like that since 2012. It's been posted and it's been updated accordingly whenever changes were necessary. We've also provided that privacy policy to numerous requests by the advocacy groups that are present on this call. But I will point out that Section K of that speaks directly to redress procedures and how one would question their presence within a database and what the procedures would be for challenging that. So that is publicly posted, so just so folks know. So I will start with that. As far as the administration acknowledging
But can you go into specifics, David? Because we have folks who obviously are tuning in. So what specifically, if I'm harmed by the database, what do I do to get some type of justice and accountability?
So I don't have that section sitting right in front of me. So let me paraphrase, please, and then
Or what would the practice be, I should say, not just the policy. What would the practice be? Thank you.
The practice would be to issue a letter to the Office of the Legal Advisor at Boston Police Department stating the case of what's going on with the concern about being misrepresented in law enforcement documentation, let's say. And then from there, that will be brought to our attention. And then what we will do is we will go through our records to determine whether or not the individual was in fact contained within a database. We will look into whether or not, we'll look into the circumstances surrounding why that person may have been in the database. Technically, these people, nobody should be in a database that we have unless that person was placed in there for official law enforcement purposes subject to law enforcement operations or investigations. So we would be looking to see if that's the case. In instances where somebody was put into a database based upon reasonable suspicion of criminal activity, we would go back and we would double check all of our data to ensure that that person was in there for a justified reason. And then we would work with our legal advisors to determine what the next steps should be, depending on what the circumstances are.
Has the department ever found that someone was wrongfully included on the database?
I am aware of one instance where we received an inquiry of an individual, and I don't want to give too many of the specifics here because I don't want to get it wrong, but when we did realize that that person was not in the database accurately, we removed them.
Okay, I'm just mindful of time. I know I have two other questions on the table, and then I'll go back around to council colleagues.
Yes, ma'am. So your question that you led off with, which I think is a very, very important question about whether or not the administration is mindful of the demographic breakdown within the gang database. Yes, ma'am, we are very mindful of that. We have done analysis, and I don't think that I have time to read it, but we are aware of the demographic breakdown. And what we have found is a positive correlation between the demographic breakdown in the gang database and that of victims of shootings over the last 5 years. The neighborhood that has been subject to the majority of the firearm violence over the last 5 years, as well as arrests for shooting incidents most recently. So let me give you just a couple of statistics here. So the gang database, as far as some of the statistics, so approximately 0.5% of the city's population is represented in the gang database. As of right now, there's a total of 3,883 people in the city's gang database. So that represents less than 1/2 or around 1/2 of 1%. Questions have come up about other cities' gang databases. I know Chicago was mentioned. Chicago's gang database has 5% of their population in it, and they have a population of 2.7 million people. So just to consider that. In 2020, over 40% of individuals arrested for firearm offenses were in the gang database. 49% of individuals arrested for shootings in 2020 were in the gang database. Over the last 5 years, an average of 31% of shooting victims were in the gang database, and over 94% of the individuals in the gang database have been arrested for a criminal offense in Boston, and over 98% of the individuals in the gang database have a criminal history in or outside of Boston. So I know that there are more questions. I can get into more details on this data if you guys would like me to. I'd be happy to. But to answer your question, yes, ma'am, we are very aware of this. And our goal is not to put people in the gang database. Our goal is to, you know, keep our community throughout Boston safe, our practitioners safe, our service providers safe, and ideally work with folks like Rufus and his group and many of these other health and human service advocacy groups to find alternatives for these young men and women who are included in the gang database to be safe.
Well, my timer is about to go off in 5 seconds. One of the other questions I had, which I can come back around on, was knowing these racial disparities to exist in this system, what is the city doing to eradicate them, right? But I can come back around. I want to be respectful of council colleagues. So I'm not sure if Councilor Sabi George is still here. Councilor Flynn. Councilor Arroyo. And then I'll go to Councilor Baker and Councilor Mejia.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Doing my timer.
I believe I heard 3,800, was it 83? Is that the number in the database?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
Does that include inactive?
So let me explain that, please, because we are in the process of implementing a updated rule. So as of right now, yes, that does still include inactive, but we have proposed rule changes to the gang assessment database that I do plan on sharing with you all when I have an opportunity to finish that aspect of things here. But yes, there are 101 active gangs in the database, including a total of, there's 124 total when you include the inactive. But we are, per the rule change that we're working on, we are working to end the inactive.
Yeah, so thank you, David, because you always try to be very thorough, but I have like 5 minutes, so I got to just make sure I get directly to what I'm asking. So basically, just to be 100% crystal clear, 3,883 is the entire totality of what you have in your gang database. That's the entire number as of right now? Okay. And you said only one, to your knowledge, one person has ever successfully lobbied themselves off of this by asking for investigation of some sort. Do you know how many requests you've gotten for that?
To be removed from the gang database?
Yeah.
Let's just say that so few beyond that one that I have zero recollection of it.
Okay. So now I just want to get into how we do this gang database, because I think part of the thing here, David, is you're at BRIC, so you're not actually in the field, correct?
That is correct.
And so you get FIOs from Boston police officers, and then you compile those FIOs into data, essentially. That's your job, right? I mean, I'm sure there's other things there, but that's how this works, right?
Not necessarily, no. But go on.
Well, so let me ask you this. How does it differ from that?
So
how are you receiving this data, if not from BPD?
So we do not just field FIOs to look for people to put into a gang database by any means. We typically, I mean, there's a lot of analysis that is occurring within that violent crime portfolio. And through our work with members of the Youth Violence Strike Force, they oftentimes are, they're interacting with the public. They're focused on interacting with the community in these areas that have this going on. They oftentimes will provide us with names of individuals for consideration to be placed into that database. And then upon that time, we would review records within the police department that we have access to, as well as any other records that we would be privy to against that point criteria. And we use analytic judgments and methodologies to review that data to determine whether or not there's reasonable suspicion to believe that that individual does in fact belong in the database as associated with a group. And I can tell you that there are times when people are provided to us that we do not find justification to put them in the database. So it's not just
let me ask you this. One of the things about police reports is that they're prepared for trial proceedings or prepared for court. And because of that, there's a level of depth to the narrative portion. They ensure that they're touching certain points. You might be familiar with wokewindows.org. They have over 44,000 FIOs, which have their narratives there. And I was actually in preparation for this, I went through hundreds of them. And I was not thoroughly impressed, frankly, with the amount of narrative. And I realized that the amount of narrative here is, and I'll give you an example, for instance, and this is an FIO from actually last year. Observation only, active Bailey Street member, redacted. That's the entire narrative. Then you got another one that's Youth Violence Strike Force, which is YVSF, investigation, intel, VK16. Another one. That's the entire narrative. Observation only, operating, because he was in a vehicle, operating a vehicle, XXX, active H Block gang associate, Youth Violence Strike Task Force, another one. Then you've got one that's same thing. It's literally the same thing. Then you got these ones, which are a little bit more troubling from a racial profiling standpoint. Youth Violence Strike Task Force, Intel, VK08, redacted, seen loitering at a laundromat on several occasions, redacted, known to associate with MS-13 members. So somebody's at the laundromat. Then you've got this one, which troubled me because of the ages. And the ages of these three individuals were 15, 15, and 16. Two of them are race unknown. One of them is Black. Frisked. So they were frisked. They're walking down the street. This is the narrative. Gang investigation, VNF associate, which is Orchard Park, I believe, or Orchard Gardens, one or the other. And this is how they characterize this 15-year-old. Build, small, skin tone, dark, ethnicity, not of Hispanic origin. Other clothing, tan pants, gray jacket. 15 years old. Stop and frisk because they put the frisk, so they were frisked and searched, all three of them. The narrative is literally just gang investigation, VNF association. So when I'm looking at these, what it strikes me as is even as you're getting data, your data is only as good as the collection methods and as the folks collecting it. And if I were looking at this from the standpoint of people's constitutional civil rights to due process, to the ability to say, you're saying I'm a gang member or a gang associate, this one right here is a perfect example of where I would have an issue. Officers, I'm going to keep the officers' names out of it, but two officers, at the request of another officer, go to Roberts Playground in Dorchester. They observe a above-listed gang member and associates.
I'll let you finish, Royal, and then I'll come back around to you.
Officer speaks to who they're terming a Lucerne associate, redacted, who stated that, quote, he was just there to watch the game and that he would be leaving soon. And then the FIO states that it's filed, and it's 4 different names, and I'm assuming they're now being lumped together as associates because one of them's watching a game and would be leaving soon at the local park. And so when we talk about how this gets done, I recognize that on your point, you're looking at the data and you're saying this data is coming from various points and I'm not applying any kind of racial lens to the data as I receive it. I'm not doing anything, nefarious. I'm not trying personally to put people on this gang database, but this gang database is compiled by officers who are out in the streets, putting together reports that are never challenged, that there's no way to verify who's at this actual park. There's no way to verify who actually said what. There's no way to verify any of that unless in that moment, that person is given the opportunity to say, yes or no, I was there. There's no case, essentially. You're not actually doing a legal case. But the results of those FIOs can then be used to denote gang status and compiled as a whole become a Parksman's legal case, either at ICE or at a criminal junction when they're in court.
Councilor Royal?
A gang associate. So I'll get into the rest of that because I do have questions based on that, but I did not.
I'll come back around. But no, I hear you. I'll come back around. Councilor Baker. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead. And then I'll go to Councilor Baker.
I promise I'll be as
go
succinct
ahead.
as possible here. So Councilor Arroyo, I would be concerned too if that was in fact the way that things happened here, but it's not. All of the data that we look at is subject to rigorous scrutiny and analysis. We would never take an FIO such as what you just described and use that as a prescriptive measure to put an individual into a gang database. In certain circumstances where it is unclear, we would reach out to the officers that were involved in that and seek some clarification. I would also say that the gang database is not compiled by the officers. The officers, yes, they provide us with information, but there's independent analysis that gets conducted up here to determine whether or not that data is defensible to place in the database. Please keep one thing in mind, and I understand that there are trust issues here, but we operate under the philosophy of garbage in, garbage out. There's no reason why we are going to seek to put people who are not gang members in the gang database, because it's going to create problems in court during prosecutions and all sorts of other issues. So I just want to point that fact out. And lastly, as of last summer, FIO only verifications made up less than 17% of all verifications. And according to the new rule changes, we will no longer be able to use FIOs on their own solely to verify an individual. And we're actively working, even without the rule being officially updated in place, to rid the system of FIO only, and as I mentioned earlier, to rid the system of inactive gang members.
Councillor Baker.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Somewhat on that point there, why would an observing officer think that seeing someone at a laundromat or at a game is pertinent information?
Deputy Gaines here. It could be pursuant to an ongoing investigation. It could be the area that he's in. It could be conflicting with another group that's in that area. There's a few different reasons it could be, a hotspot area where things are going on and there's been an uptick in firearm-related violence, and so that's a few of the reasons.
So if someone were actually looking for that person, they could go back in and see the FIOs and say, maybe this person hangs at this laundromat, or like, would they use those previous entrance into the FIO database or wherever that information goes?
They could, yeah, possibly.
Yeah, okay. Can someone, David or whoever, I had asked this question on the earlier panel, do we have a sense of how many people have been deported in the last, 3 years based on BRIC information sharing with ICE?
Unfortunately, we do not have an answer to that. I'm only aware of the two circumstances that have been presented by the panel where that was where a problem arose related to verifications in the gang database. Just those two instances.
So those are actually they went all the way to deportation. Do we have a sense in like how many cases we're sharing with ICE? If you know of just 2 cases that were deported, how many people are we looking at and possibly sharing information with ICE?
So, Counselor, back at the time when this was happening, it was coming off the heels of a very, very, very violent summer in East Boston, in the Belle Isle area, involving a transnational organized crime gang group that was very, very brutally assaulting and killing people. That gang became the subject of a federal RICO investigation that ICE was participating in. And our community in East Boston was literally being terrorized by this group. We provided supporting information to aid an investigation, criminal investigations, I must add, related to the violence that was occurring there. And as a result, there were numerous prosecutions that should all be available somewhere within the U.S. Department of Justice, U.S. Attorney's Office. I'm sure they could pull that data for you at some point. And as I mentioned before, I'm only aware of 2 instances where there were, challenges to some of the deportation proceedings that occurred. I don't know how many people were put in jail versus how many people they enacted deportation proceedings on, but I do know that the 2 individuals that there was an issue with their deportation proceeding, they started out with ICE in an investigation, and that's what led them there. In a criminal investigation.
Yeah, murder. Is there a way to, if someone suspects that, if I suspect that I'm on the gang database, Is there a way for me to reach out somehow to get that personally, to get that information, get confirmation, yes, I am on the database, and if I don't think I should be on that database, is there a way for me as a citizen of the United States to be able to come off that database?
Yes, sir. And that is per the redress procedures that I outlined a little while ago for Councilor Campbell. And the details on that are in our Information, Privacy, Civil Rights, and Civil Liberties Protection Policy, and it's outlined there. Now, so yes, the short answer to that is yes, sir.
And how would that, like, if it's me, how am I going to start that process? Do I call, do I like complain to like police headquarters? Was there someone in particular that I would log my complaint to?
I would log that complaint to the Office of the Legal Advisor at Boston Police Department, and it would have to be reviewed.
Yeah, and I mean, I would be concerned about how long that review period would take. Is that going to take 2 years or something like that? You don't need to answer that. But and Rufus, can you talk a little bit about? You said that with the help of the BRIC, you target individuals for Operation Exit. Can you talk about that a little bit? How that happens? Who is identified? Are those the worst players there that you're trying to get your arms around? And what type of success have you had there?
Thank you, Counselor. So for Operation Exit, the idea is to pull individuals who are most likely to be engaged in active gang activity. And to date, we have 104 graduates. Of the 104, 80% are still involved in the trade. So it has been a very successful program, and we're in the process of trying to increase the capacity of that program as well. But just in terms of the support we receive from BPD has helped us out with some of the vetting process of some of the individuals we have. And also we want to make sure that oftentimes I hear critiques that we don't have the right people in certain programs. So this was a way in which we can alleviate some of that, where we make sure that we are getting the individuals who are most active, and also the individuals who have some level of community impact, where if they start going on the positive track, they can have a impact on their group and also on their community as well. So that's been the history of Operation Exit. And
yeah, the big players are going to ripple out and
that's
yeah. So you said people,
went off. I'm gonna.
Can I ask one more question? I'm sorry,
and then I'm going
Chair.
to Council Mejia.
Sure. Kind of blow my train of thought there. So when you said, Rufus, some people are saying that we weren't directing the right people in there. What do they mean by that? Were they not necessarily impact players? Were they just?
To be honest, I think that what we realize is that there are tiers. There's a tiered system in terms of involvement in gang activity. We wanted to make sure that in Operation Exit, that we were attracting those tier 1 individuals, meaning the ones who are most likely to be engaged in gun violence, particularly during those summer months when we see those numbers rising. So to sort of alleviate some of that, we wanted to make sure that we cross-reference not only our own research in terms of our relationships, we wanted to make sure that they were also reflected in some of the data that we had available.
Thank you. And I've heard from people in the trades good reports about the people that are coming out of Operation Exit. That it's a lifeline for them. So that's a good project. Thank you everybody for coming on, Rufus, and the people from the BRIC. Thank you for what you guys do. Thank you.
Council Mejia.
Oh boy. All right, guys.
Yeah, so I'm going to just be super mindful of time. And so I want there will be times when I'm just going to want a yes or no answer. And I kind of want to really facilitate this because I want to get through everything that I want to put out here. So I'm just curious in terms of supervisors of color and women who are in BRIC, how many do we have? Do we have any supervisors of color?
Yes, Councilor Mejia. This is Superintendent Wilson. Yeah, we have 3 supervisors who are of color. They're all male. And then within the detective ranks, we have both women and men of color in our detective ranks as well.
Do you track any homicides that have been solved based on the info from the database? How do you do that?
So that would be handled exclusively by the BPD homicide unit.
Okay. And do you take into account officer misconduct when inputting data?
That would be possibly a function of internal affairs if there was some violation of rules. We wouldn't necessarily deal with misconduct. That's a whole different bureau.
So I'm kind of trying to like get into I'm just curious in terms, for instance, if an officer was involved in misconduct, do you still use their reports for the database? What if the officer was found unreliable or untruthful in court? Would you still use their reports?
The thing is that if internal affairs investigates it, he'll be disciplined appropriately. And then at that point, he would fall under scrutiny, whether testifying in court or handing over any type of reports. So we would give it a hard look, but it's difficult to answer that question succinctly because there's too many variables. But to your general point, it's very important for an officer to have credibility, particularly when under oath testifying in court.
So I'm just getting some, there's just been some conflicting messages that I've been hearing from folks who are within the system, that there aren't any supervisors of color or women in the gang unit. Is that true?
I'm sorry, did you say I was only answering for the brick.
Okay, so in regards to the gang unit in particular, I've heard that there are no supervisors of color or women in the gang unit. Can you just talk to me a little bit about that?
As far as supervisors, there are no supervisors of color. As far as women, there are women in the gang unit, but they are not supervisors.
Do you know why that is?
I don't.
And do you think that that has something to do in terms of kind of like the racial discrepancies that we continue to have? Like, do you see a correlation between that? Just curious.
Well, I mean, we're working to make some changes. I just lost 2 supervisors. I'm trying to get 2 new ones up there, so I'm trying to make some changes to the unit right now myself.
Okay.
So it's a work in progress.
Okay. So then I'm just curious, how are people notified when they are entered into the database within BPD, either BRIC or the gang unit? How are they notified? Do you get an email? Do you get a phone call? What's that process look like?
You're not.
You're not. Okay. I just want to mention that something in regards to youth violence programs, I don't think that anyone here believes that there shouldn't be any violence prevention services offered. But what we need to do is look at what is going to do the most good. And the fact of the matter is that not a lot of people feel comfortable right now taking violence prevention programming from government and the police. So I just think that we need to really be relying more on the community and on nonprofits and on advocates to truly get the message out that their violence prevention is an option. So I just kind of want us to really think about that. And then I understand that according to the BPD, the purpose of the gang database is to provide analysis of violent offenses. But when you look at the point system, it includes things like being in a photo with a gang member or published news accounts. How can we reasonably draw a connection between being in a photograph and committing a violent offense? Can you explain that to us?
Absolutely. So the gang is involved in criminal activity. The gang database contains information on individuals that are reasonably suspected of association with those gangs.
And I'm just out of curiosity, when you refer to Humble Ave, why is it, I hear that it's referred to as H block. Is that something that you think is culturally competent?
Well, it's referred to as H block because a lot of the streets up there begin with H, and that's why it's H block.
They also call themselves H block.
Correct.
No, I'm just.
So we don't name the gang.
I'm curious about just kind of like the cultural competency and just kind of the impact that will have on communities of color, whether you live on Humble or not. Like just in terms of modeling behavior. Is there another way that we can be a little bit more responsive to and be more intentional about the cultural competency of those who are working?
Well, I hear what you're saying, but that's what they refer to themselves as based on the streets in the area. That's what they refer to themselves as H blocks.
And so that's how, those are how calls are dispatched. It's H block. When calls are being made, it's like we're.
I would think they would give the address of the street house where they're dispatching.
So I just kind of want to be really super mindful of, in terms of just the intent and impact, that a lot of some of the reasons why we're even having this conversation is just how communities are being labeled, and how those affiliated names can also send the wrong message out to communities, and being labeled that way. It's like an open season on our on certain neighborhoods, right? So I'm just encouraging you all to be a little bit more culturally competent and mindful of how those things land for the greater community.
Yeah, we can be more mindful, sure.
Yeah, and I think that what we, in terms of accountability.
Go ahead, Councilman.
Yeah, no, I just feel like it's great, and I'm glad that we're having this hearing, but I think that we're all, if we're really serious about handling this problem, then we need to get real, that a lot of this is also who is leading the BRIC and who is leading the gang unit, and what that all looks like. So if we don't have people of diverse experiences and backgrounds and positions of leadership, then these are the sort of things that are going to continue to happen here in the city of Boston. And so if we're really serious about the work, then it needs to be more than just we're considering doing this and we're trying to, because there's talent out there. There needs to be the will to create space for people of color to step into those leadership positions. And that is what I think these times require, because we probably would be having a different conversation if that was the case.
Thank you, Council Mejia. Just being mindful, another hearing. I just have one question. I'll go back to Council Royal, and then I have to see if anyone has public testimony. What scientific or research does the department use to actually determine what the criteria is?
Counselor, the criteria that we use was adopted from the Department of Corrections. And it's a methodology that is used by the Department of Corrections for evaluating the risk implications of threat groups internal to the prison systems. So they use this point system in order to reduce risk within their facilities. We adopted the point system from the Massachusetts Department of Corrections several years ago, many years ago. What we did is we evaluated the criteria, and we made adjustments to it in order to be reflective of the data sets that we could utilize for verification purposes. So in other words, we took it out of the context of a corrections institution and put it into the context of a police department. Subsequent follow-up with numerous sheriff's departments and police departments around the country indicated that they use a very, very similar approach to doing this. I don't know of an exact science that is being used across the board, but I will say that our point system has stood the test of time in court. And based on statistics that we have calculated, such as some of the statistics that I've provided before, it is indicative of us actually analyzing the right people for placement into the database.
And then my last question, and I can follow up with more, just given the fact that there's another council hearing, is obviously you guys mentioned a couple of times some rule changes. I'm just curious, what is driving the rule changes? Is it disparities that the city is seeing in the database? Is it some folks raising questions around the flaws in the pointing system? What's driving it?
So we actually started working on changes to this rule well over a year ago, well before COVID, before a lot of the tragic incidents that occurred nationwide. We've been working diligently on this, thoughtfully. We've listened to what the community has had to say. We've had discussions with our internal and external partners for feedback. We've listened to dissenting opinions that have come from the courts. And ultimately, we are always looking to improve. That's the truth. You know, we want this to be something that works for us for the operational purposes that we described, and we want to make sure that we have a, you know, we operate in a trusted environment. And so we have proposed a number of changes to it. I could read those changes to you briefly if you'd like, or we can move on. It's up to you.
You can read them quickly, and then I'm going to go to Councilor Royal.
So regardless of the effectiveness of the gang database to date, we remain committed to excellence and continued improvement. In order to constantly improve our policies and procedures, we're considering the following proposed changes. We believe that this will further enhance controls and safeguards regarding access to the information in the database. As mentioned earlier, FIOs can no longer be used as a sole criteria for verification. This addresses the concern that a person could be entered into the gang database with points only from FIOs. We're working on the removal of the inactive status. This will help ensure that those individuals will be reviewed for purge or recategorized to more accurately reflect their participation in gang activity. In the interest of transparency and accountability, we're adding an annual public reporting requirement regarding the number of individuals added to and purged from the database. And the rule changes will also clarify the purpose of the gang assessment database in preventing and reducing violence and victimization in the city, clarify the role of the BRIC in management of the database, and further tighten up criteria for access, submission, verification, dissemination, and review. So we think that these changes will further improve our capabilities, both to prevent and reduce violence.
Thank you, David. Councilor Royal, I'll go to you for a few minutes, and then I'm going to go to public testimony. I think we have to wrap up by 4 because of another hearing and central staff. Thank you.
Just because I was trying to find this and I couldn't find the BPD annual homicide report. I think the last one was in 2018. Is that accurate? Have they done one for 2019, 2020, and 2021? Well, 2021 would be now, so no, but 2019 and 2020?
So sir, are you asking if we've released our final statistics for the year?
No. So BPD does an annual homicide report where they sort of break down all different versions of homicide and how it breaks down. The last one I saw was in 2018. I couldn't find a more recent one for 2019 or 2020. Is the last time that BPD did an annual homicide report 2018?
I couldn't answer that question for you, sir. That would be the homicide unit that provides that.
All right, so let me get right into why I'm asking. I think we've heard multiple times, often the justification for the gang database, for these intrusions on communities where we have folks doing FIOs and just basically doing observation, which, by the way, takes time, takes officer manpower, takes officer time. But we also have seen when that doesn't go well, like Officer Crossan's interaction, and what that does for community trust and what that does for community interaction with police officers in the instance of trying to help with crime when they feel antagonized in that way. And so, you know, one of the things that I was looking for this was I would love to have any kind of data that shows where the gang database itself was the reason a murder was solved or resolved, where the gang database actually helped in a definitive way solve an actual murder. And when I was looking for this, I found a Washington Post article that was covered also by the Boston Globe. The Boston Globe story was "Wide Gap in Boston Homicide Clearance Rates Draws Questions." And that was published in 2018, which coincidentally was the last time that I could find a BPD annual homicide report. And what it said specifically was that though Boston police have made an arrest in nearly 90% of homicides with white victims, only 42% of homicides with black victims, who account for the vast majority since 2007, who account for the vast majority of the city's killings, the data shows 38% of outdoor fatal shootings were solved. And so of the 435 homicides in that time from 2018 to 2007, 254 remain unsolved in terms of black victims. 38% of outdoor fatal shootings were solved. And both of these things I've heard time and time again essentially correlated with gangs, that these crimes, these outdoor shootings are gang related. These black victims are oftentimes decried as gang related. And so what we're talking about here is relatively low clearance rates. And when I'm thinking about what this is worth, what is this kind of infringement on a community's constitutional rights? What would allow me to say this is such a valuable tool that I'm going to allow this to happen, even though it's either right on the line of what I would consider sort of constitutional infringement, or it has these sort of troubling racial profiling patterns, or these other things. The value has to be there. And I think that's true for you as well. You would like this to have some value. But to your knowledge, do you keep any data that says, because of the gang database, we solved this murder? Do you keep that data?
We do not keep that data.
So every time you say gang
The BRIC
database,
does not.
so, okay, so the BRIC does not. So the BRIC actually cannot say statistically how often the gang database has actually helped solve a murder. They don't have the ability to say that?
I don't think so, no.
Okay. The other thing I saw was that even though the gang database has been around for a while, in 2018, WGBH wrote a story that dealt with, and this was the headline, Boston police closed fewer cases even as homicide rates rose last year. And so in 2018, they had lower case closes than 2017, and they had lower cases closed than 2016. And so, and that's on a total. And so, you know, my concern here is when we're talking about data and tools, tools have to be justified for their effectiveness. And there's all kinds of questions for me where there's no justification so far for this program's effectiveness beyond BPD saying, trust us, it helps. But there's no data, there's nothing there. And I guess my last question on this, because I want to be mindful of time, is, you know,
I'll have to have you send it. Sorry, Councilor Royal, because they scheduled another hearing afterwards.
So I'll have to send it. I don't want to get in. I know we have scheduling issues, and I want to allow for community comment. So I'll send them.
And we'll follow up for sure.
And I thank you for trying your best to answer these questions. I know we're asking you a lot of data-centric questions, and you might not have those things readily available. So thank you.
That's okay. I mean, what you're asking specifically about is solving crimes, and what we use the database for primarily is to prevent acts of violence and to provide services to at-risk individuals to get them out of that. So, you know, I know of plenty of ways that it's been used proactively to get ahead of retaliatory gang violence, for sure. Do I have a tracking mechanism that calculates every single time that happens, or captures data from other units that have the responsibility for investigating various types of crimes? We don't have a system like that in the BRIC. It looks like Rufus has something that he wanted to say as well, so I'll defer to him.
No, he was jumping off. He had another conflict, David. But we'll follow up with more questions because obviously, you know, there's still a lot more questions, of course. And the question that Councilor Royal ended with is also a question that has come up, right? Not just around transparency and how we're solving for the disparities issues in the data, but also what informs a criteria, what research, what scholarship informs a criteria, and then of course, the value question. And does it outweigh the harm that folks have been talking about, obviously, at the beginning of this hearing? So we'll follow up and I'll make sure that you guys get those questions. I do want to go to public testimony and acknowledge there are a couple of folks here who have been extremely patient, which I appreciate, to offer a public testimony. And I have to limit it to 2 minutes. But I'm going to first go to Trucy. I see you. If you could say your name, obviously your affiliation. Also want to acknowledge you and your work, but also thank you for being here and for your patience as well.
Oh, no, you're welcome. Thank you, Councilor Campbell, for letting me jump in first. So Trucy Allah for the record, and I'm working currently at the Executive Office of Public Safety and Security. And so my relationship with the BRIC is twofold. My first introduction to the BRIC and the gang database was when I was working at the Suffolk County Sheriff's Department with the Boston Reentry Initiative. The way that program worked, it was largely in part due to the BRIC. And I was one of those guys in the community that never wanted to embrace the idea of impact players or gang-involved youth. Community mentor, faith-based, I just despised it. A year or so into my role as a liaison for the sheriff, I realized that the guys that were being submitted to us to be on this panel for intervention and prevention work was the exact it was the right population. I'm not, that's not for me to take a side, good, bad, or indifferent. That's just a fact. So I go back some time, and in BPD, and at that time wrote the grants, fought for the funding for people who graduated from the BRIC through attrition, like myself, to work with guys that were impact players. So I come at this from from two different angles, and I could say that at the time BPD had a civilian employee that worked out of the BRIC, Nilvia, beautiful. She would sift through that thesis of information, and she would pluck out the guys that were identified for the Boston Reentry Initiative. Because what was happening is guys were telling the mentors that I was supervising that they were doing the right things. They were going to work. They were being accountable. But then they were getting FIO'd in hotspots that they were representing. So I used it from an authenticity litmus test, if you will. So one guy, and then we would call them on their stuff when they were not being forthright. Now, that's not to say that the biggest room in the house is not room for improvement. We can all improve. BPD would own that as well. But I would say that if we had like Louis D. Brown Peace Institute on here, and some of the mothers who were survivors of homicide had a case that was resolved because of the BRIC or the gang database, I don't think that they would have any qualms with how that result was transpired. So those are my comments, and those are been my interaction with the BRIC.
No, I appreciate you being here, Trucy. And if you want to follow up and send some more written testimony, feel free. We circulate it to the counselors and to other folks who want access to the record for the hearing. So I appreciate you being here. We'll stay in contact with you for sure on this issue as we move forward.
I appreciate it.
Thank you, Trucy.
Okay, thank you.
And now I literally have probably 2 minutes. Actually, I'm way over time. But Emily, do you want to offer a public testimony?
If there is still time, Councilor Campbell. I know we are way over. I will keep it very short.
Nope, go right ahead. And I appreciate your patience and you being here the entire time and the work you do.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you to the counselors for holding this hearing. Thank you to everyone for being here. I appreciate the administration being here today as well to answer questions. And thank you, Councilor Campbell, for also clarifying that we only declined the meeting with the administration over COVID concerns and not because we're not interested in continuing dialogue with them. I know that we are limited on time, so I don't want to repeat the things that were said by the other panelists and yourself and Councilor Arroyo, who have been really leading on these issues. But I do want to note that a lot of the advocates and some of the counselors are really focused on the harmful impacts, which is also the things that I'm concerned about. And just to back up, I didn't introduce myself. I'm Emily Long. I'm an immigration attorney from the Justice Center of Southeast Mass. And that's the lens that I come to this work from. And I think that the advocates are focused on the negative impacts, and I think the administration and some of their folks are really focused on the positive youth interventions that happen and some of the benefits that come out of it. And I just want to state that these two things can be true at the same time. The BRIC can be harmful and can also be helpful in these ways. And I think if most of the focus of the benefit that we're discussing is on these youth interventions or these violence interventions, then why do we not decouple the criminalization of these communities from the interventions that we're trying to provide? If there's a funding stream issue, if there's intelligence that needs to be shared in order to identify people, we don't need to also support the criminalization of these communities in order to provide them with support services. I will also reiterate the things that my colleague Elizabeth discussed, which is that we personally have not actually seen those services be offered to a lot of youth that we have seen been identified, and in pouring through the thousands of records, we have also not seen that been a subject of the discussions among BRIC and other, this is mostly in the Boston Public School context. We haven't seen that been the primary objective within those communications. So I might push back a little bit on that point. I did also want to touch on the fact of ICE access, which was discussed. And I know that it's been said in this hearing and previous hearings that ICE doesn't have direct access. And I understand that they don't have direct access, but they do have access to plenty of information from the BRIC. I have seen emails directly back and forth between the BRIC and ICE officials. They're part of email chains. They have access to BRIC daily calls. They have access to all sorts of information. So whether or not that access is direct, so to speak, it's as direct as it needs to be because people can get the information that they want. And I did just want to finish with asking if the administration is also going to be removing individuals from the database who are in there based solely on those FIO verifications, because in the client cases that we have looked at, we know that folks were verified based only on FIOs and that there were negative impacts from that. Clearly, I'm coming from the immigration context, but I just wanted to give that example. I know we're very short on time and I've talked a lot about these things in the past, but those are just a few things that I wanted to bring up.
No, this is helpful. And thank you, Emily, for your patience and for providing information. And I think you're exactly right. You know, we created the space so folks could come together to hear the concerns from everybody. And so we're all on the same page. And I think what is abundantly clear is that we all agree that there is still work to be done to fix the system. And that it is indeed harming folks at different times and different junctures and in different ways. And so we will continue this conversation, continue the hearing. I will follow up with the BRIC and the administration on specific additional questions I get from council colleagues who ran out of time, of course, and get those over to the administration to respond to, including any additional questions from folks from the advocacy world. I want to thank everyone for being here today. I want to thank everyone for their patience. I want to thank everyone for productive conversation. Clearly still work to do. I also want to thank my council colleagues for being here. Council Mejia and Council Arroyo, thank you so much. Obviously, this was a long hearing, and we will continue the work that needs to be done immediately because these racial inequities are real. And I think there were some folks who doubted whether or not they were real. And we got that from, I think, everyone on here, that there's still work to be done in that regard. So thank you all so much. I also want to thank Central staff. I know we're late. There's another hearing going on. Hopefully you guys can get a quick break before the next council hearing. But thank you, Central staff, Carrie, Michelle and Shane as well. Thank you so much. This hearing is adjourned. Bye, everyone.